There's a particular kind of legend that only motorsport can create. Not the kind built in press conferences or carefully curated social media posts, but the kind hammered into existence lap after lap, year after year, through an almost inhuman refusal to yield. Dale Earnhardt was that kind of legend. He was the son of a textile mill worker from Kannapolis, North Carolina, a man who dropped out of ninth grade to race cars, who went bankrupt twice before his 30th birthday, who was divorced, estranged, and nearly broken before he ever reached the peak of his powers. And then he won 7 NASCAR Cup Series championships, matched only by Richard Petty in the entire history of the sport, and became the most feared and beloved figure in American motorsport. But the story most people know, the championships, the black number 3, the Intimidator, only scratches the surface. Beneath the legend lies a collection of stories so astonishing, so haunting, and so deeply human that they reframe everything you thought you understood about Dale Earnhardt. What follows are the things you almost certainly did not know. Long before Dale Earnhardt was signing multi-million-dollar sponsorship deals and building a racing organization that fielded multiple Cup Series cars, he was standing in a courtroom watching his financial world collapse. In 1971, Earnhardt filed for bankruptcy. He was barely in his 20s, already separated from his second wife, supporting children he could barely see, and running cars that fell apart before they finished races. He owed money he could not repay. He had no full-time sponsor, no steady crew, and no guarantee that tomorrow would be any different from yesterday. What is remarkable is not the bankruptcy itself. Plenty of young men with racing dreams hit similar walls, but what Earnhardt did in the years immediately following it. He did not pivot to a safer career. He did not take the textile mill job that could have provided stability. He went back to the track. He drove whatever jalopy someone would put beneath him, and he drove it like a man with absolutely nothing left to lose, which at that point was very nearly the truth. It was that desperation, that willingness to push a car to and beyond its limits because every race might be the last one anyone would let him run, that first caught the attention of veteran car owner Rod Osterland. Osterland gave Earnhardt a full-time ride in 1979, and Earnhardt promptly won Rookie of the Year. The following season, 1980, he won his first Cup Series championship. From bankruptcy to champion in fewer than 10 years. The poverty and the failure were not detours. They were the curriculum. The story of how Dale Earnhardt nearly lost his championship chance before it even began is one of the least told in NASCAR history. In 1979, his first full season with Rod Osterland's team, Earnhardt was involved in a serious accident at Pocono Raceway that fractured both his collarbones. The injury was severe enough that it should have ended his season entirely. In an era when sports medicine meant roughly, tape it up and see how it goes, Earnhardt climbed back into a race car weeks before any physician would have recommended it. He drove with fractures that had not properly healed, enduring pain that would have grounded most competitors. The details of just how much pain he raced through during that 1979 season were not widely reported at the time. The culture of the sport demanded that drivers present an image of invulnerability, and Earnhardt was nothing if not a devoted practitioner of that culture. What the record does show is that he won the Rookie of the Year award that season, setting the stage for the 1980 championship that would be the first of 7. Had he sat out those races to recover properly, had his results suffered enough to cost him the Osterland ride, the entire trajectory of NASCAR history changes. The championships that defined the sport's modern era, the rivalries with Jeff Gordon, the rise of Dale Earnhardt Incorporated, all of it traces back to a man who refused to let broken bones stop him. When Dale Earnhardt tied Richard Petty's record of 7 Cup Series championships in 1994, winning his 7th title at the end of one of the most competitive seasons the sport had seen, the moment was historic and yet also quietly tense. Petty, the king himself, was not exactly enthusiastic about watching his record being equaled. The relationship between the two men was respectful but cool, carrying the weight of era against era, generation against generation. Earnhardt had made no secret of his admiration for Petty's records and his desire to break them, which is not necessarily the kind of thing that warms a man's heart toward a rival. What is less known is that Earnhardt, despite equaling the record, never publicly stated his intention to stop at 7. Throughout the late 1990s, he continued racing with full intensity, genuinely believing and telling friends and journalists that he would win an 8th championship before he was done. He came agonizingly close on multiple occasions. In 1995, 1996, and again in 2000, he mounted serious title challenges that fell short by margins that still cause fans to wince when they examine the final standings. The 8th championship he sought so openly became one of racing's most famous uncompleted journeys, a ghost that trailed the black number 3 all the way to Daytona in February 2001. Of all the paradoxes in Dale Earnhardt's career, none is more startling than his relationship with the Daytona 500. The race is the most prestigious event on the NASCAR calendar, the one every driver points to as the crown jewel of the sport. Earnhardt won at Daytona many times, in other races on other weekends, but the 500 itself seemed determined to break him. He started the race 22 times before finally winning it in 1998. 22 starts. Along the way, the race seemed to invent new methods specifically to deny him. He ran out of fuel in 1986 with 3 laps remaining while leading. In 1990, he was leading with less than a lap to go and cut a tire on a piece of debris, watching Dierike Cope steal the victory. He hit seagulls. He was involved in accidents that defied statistical explanation. He had equipment failures at the cruelest possible moments. By the early 1990s, the Daytona 500 curse had become a national sports story, one of those narratives larger than statistics, rooted in the human love of watching greatness humbled by fate. When he finally won the 1998 race, the response from the entire NASCAR community was unlike anything seen before or since. Every crew member from every team lined pit road to shake his hand. Grown men who had spent years hoping he would lose on that particular Sunday were weeping. It was as though the sport itself needed him to win that race in order to feel complete. He crossed the start-finish line, doing donuts, and even the most hardened cynics struggled to keep their composure. The rivalry between Dale Earnhardt and Jeff Gordon in 1990s was not simply a sporting competition. It was a generational collision that divided NASCAR's fan base in ways that echoed far beyond the racetrack. Gordon arrived on the Cup scene as the polished, California-born, marketable face of NASCAR's corporate expansion, everything that Earnhardt, the rough-edged son of the Carolina working class, had never been and never tried to be. The contrast was too perfect. NASCAR's old guard, the fans who had followed Earnhardt since the dirt track days, saw in Gordon a symbol of everything they feared was changing about the sport. They embraced Earnhardt with a loyalty that bordered on ferocity. What is less well known is the complexity of the two men's actual relationship. Earnhardt had immense respect for Gordon's driving ability, even as he played the villain role their rivalry demanded with obvious relish. He was known to tell people in private that Gordon was the most talented driver he had competed against. Gordon, for his part, has spoken at length in the years since Earnhardt's death about what it meant to race against him, how the intimidation was real even for a driver of Gordon's abilities, and how Earnhardt's presence on any racetrack raised the level of competition simply by existing. The 4 Gordon championships in the 1990s, 1995, 1997, 1998, and 2001 came at the direct expense of Earnhardt's quest for an 8th title. That those 2 careers overlapped precisely as they did was one of motorsport's great dramatic arrangements. To understand the full weight of what Dale Earnhardt's death represented, you have to understand the safety culture of NASCAR in the late 1990s and early 2001. It was a culture that treated injury and death as occupational hazards to be managed with toughness rather than technology. Drivers routinely raced with cracked ribs, dislocated shoulders, and injuries that would have ended careers in any other sport. The attitude was explicit and stated openly. If you could not handle the danger, find a different job. Earnhardt was not a passive participant in this culture. He was one of its most vocal champions. He was famously dismissive of safety innovations, particularly those he perceived as interfering with the physical and psychological demands of driving at the limit. He drove with a loose shoulder harness, a choice that racing experts have noted since his death contributed to the severity of his injuries in the final crash. He raced without a Hans device, the head and neck support system, despite the fact that 3 drivers had died from basilar skull fractures in the 9 months before the 2001 Daytona 500. When the Hans device was demonstrated to NASCAR drivers in January 2001, Earnhardt was the only driver who did not attend the presentation. He called the device, publicly and dismissively, a noose. The terrible irony is that Earnhardt's death, more than the deaths of Adam Petty, Kenny Owen Jr., and Tony Roper before him, is what finally forced NASCAR to mandate the Hans device and begin the sweeping safety revolution that has meant not a single driver has died in a NASCAR National Series race in the quarter-century since. He was the most powerful possible argument for the very safety measures he refused. In the days and hours before the 2001 Daytona 500, people who knew Dale Earnhardt well noticed something different about him. The The focused, contained, almost hostile pre-race persona he had perfected over 2 decades seemed to have softened into something warmer and more open. He was unusually expressive in a pre-race interview, speaking about his marriage to Teresa, about his relationship with his children, about how the cars his team had built were the fastest he had ever driven. Friends who watched the footage later described it as unsettling in retrospect, a man taking stock, saying things he had perhaps meant for years and never voiced. On race morning, he did something he almost never did. He went to Dale Jr.'s car before the race began, not to issue tactical instructions, but simply to encourage his son. Jr. later recalled to reporters that his father told him they had good cars and they were going to do it together. It was a warmth that Earnhardt rarely displayed in a racing context. He also sought out Kyle Petty, whose son Adam had been killed 9 months earlier, to offer a hug and words of love that Kyle later called one of the most meaningful gestures of kindness he had ever received. Whether any of this reflected a genuine premonition or simply a man in a period of unusual contentment with his life, nobody can say with certainty. What is known is that his final radio transmission, made during a red flag period 20 laps before the end of the race, was a warning to his car owner that they were going to have to do something about the cars or someone would be killed. 20 laps later, the warning became a prophecy. Dale Earnhardt died at Halifax Medical Center in Daytona Beach on February 18, 2001. He was 49 years old. The sports response in the days, weeks, and months that followed was unlike anything American motorsport had experienced. Tributes poured in from every corner of the racing world, and far beyond it. The black number 3 disappeared from active competition, a retirement of a number so spontaneous and so total that it required no formal ceremony. His death was the end of an era in the most literal possible sense. But the deeper legacy of Dale Earnhardt is one that operates in the background of every single race run since that February afternoon. The Hans device became mandatory across NASCAR's top series in October 2001. Safer barriers, steel and foam energy reduction barriers, began appearing at tracks starting in 2002, developed by researchers whose work had been waiting for the political will to implement it. The car of tomorrow debuted in 2007 with a completely redesigned safety cell, a stronger roll cage, and a driver's seat moved toward the center of the car to reduce the vulnerability exposed by the side impacts that had claimed drivers throughout the sport's history. Closed-face helmets became mandatory. Multi-point harness systems replaced the equipment that had failed to protect drivers in side and frontal impacts. In-car data recorders were installed to allow investigators to understand crash forces in ways that had been impossible before. Every single one of those changes traces a direct line back to February 18, 2001. More than the 7